This video is about writing about literature, some things that we need to consider. What are literary papers? Well, first and foremost, they're not different in their basic components from other papers. They are centered around a debatable thesis. They are just centered around an argument related to a work of literature. And I have 3 examples here of thesis statements that make a debatable claim in relation to or in reference to a specific work of literature. In the first one, we have, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it is Victor Frankenstein, not his creature, who is the real monster. Now, first and foremost, it fits the definition of a thesis. It is debatable because normally, or kind of at first glance, the assumption is that it is the creature in the novel who is the monster, not the man who created him, not the scientist and the doctor, but in this case, the argument is that he is the ultimate real monster. In the second example, we have Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour can be viewed as a social commentary on the stifling lives women were once compelled to lead. And in the last one, we have an example that relates specifically to one of the works of literature that we will explore in this class, and that's the play Doubt. And so this thesis says that although John Patrick Shanley's play Doubt is open-ended, it is clear that Father Flynn is or is not guilty. So it would be one or the other, depending on what your opinion is regarding the play. So in essence, they're a lot like other papers. They have a debatable claim. It's just that they are about a work of literature instead of about, some other kind of topic that you might write about in a history class or a psychology class, sociology, and things like that. There are many different kinds of literary papers, but the 2 kinds that I'm going to talk about are the kind that are based on secondary sources, which these would be research papers. And then the other kind we'll talk about in just a moment are papers that are based on just the primary source itself. But secondary source papers are research papers, and these would be essays that are based not only on the short story, the novel, or the play that you're reading or studying in a given class, but they also incorporate and use scholarly books and articles about the work that you're studying or discussing in class. So these would be articles that you find from a school's database collection. Most, if not all, schools subscribe to vast and extensive databases where you have fast and ready access to peer-reviewed scholarly journals. And these are kind of the gold standard in terms of secondary sources because they go through a very rigorous approval process. Very hard to get published in these scholarly journals. And so the level of quality of the scholarly articles is generally very high. You still have to vet those sources, of course, but those are kind of the gold standard as well as scholarly books. You may also be asked to apply literary theory in a given class where you're asked to write about a work of literature. Most commonly, this would be asked of you in an actual literature class, probably not in an introductory writing class like this one, although it is possible. And some of the literary theories that you might encounter might be Marxism, feminism, historical criticism, reader response criticism, psychoanalysis, and queer theory. But we won't be covering those in this class, but just so you're familiar with those should you be asked to write about them in the future. The other kind of papers that you might be asked to write about would be those that are just based on a primary source, just a single text. In this class, for example, you will write one paper over a short story. You won't use any outside sources. It will just be you, your brain, and the short story. And then the second one that we'll write, which will be on a much longer timetable, we'll have several weeks to write the second one. It will likewise be just you, your brain, and the play in the second case. And you see a cover of that play that we'll discuss and write about a little bit later in the semester. and it's called Doubt. So those papers, you don't use any outside sources at all. So it's really important that you resist the temptation to look up things about those sources. And I realize where that temptation may come from. It may come from a lack of confidence, a feeling that, you need those outside sources to, help you make your argument. And although there's certainly circumstances and occasions for that, for these papers, we won't be doing that at all. And it's important that you don't do that, because if you look up and you read articles on a given work, it's hard to get those ideas out of your head, and it would be hard to resist the temptation to not use them in your paper. And if you were to use them and you presented those things as your own, that's a form of plagiarism. And it is an instance, an example of academic dishonesty. And if you got caught doing that, that would result in a failing grade for the paper that you did that for. And in cases of blatant and egregious plagiarism in my class, the consequence for that would be a 0. And that's kind of devastating to your average. And so we certainly don't want to do that. So for these first couple of papers, it's just the primary sources themselves. So we just need to stick to that. Plus, it's less complicated. Why write a research paper before or until you're required to? We do have 2 research papers in this class, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to do that and get experience doing that. But these first ones are just based on a single text. Okay, we also need to think about the conventions of writing about literature. Now, some of these conventions are the same as for regular papers, and some of the conventions are particular to the kinds of papers that we encounter when we're writing just about a work of literature. Now, the first one, which is writing in third-person point of view, and that simply means using pronouns like he, she, and they. That is a convention that is true not just of literary papers, but of regular papers that you would write in your college classes as well. So we don't want to use first person, so you should avoid the use of first person pronouns like I, me, my, phrases like in my opinion, I think that, and so on. Now, it is okay to include those in your rough draft if you find it paralyzing not to do so, and it's fairly easy to edit out in your revised second draft and certainly your final draft. You just go through and take out those first-person pronouns and replace them with third-person pronouns, or in some cases, just the removal of the first-person pronouns does the trick. The remaining sentences that are left are typically already in third person. The other convention is particular to writing about a work of literature, and that is writing in literary present tense. Now, what we mean by that is that since works of literature sort of stand the test of time, and we may still read things today that were written 400 years ago, like works of written by Shakespeare, for example, those things are considered to sort of live in the eternal present tense. And so the vast majority of the time when you're writing a literature paper or a literary analysis paper, you'll be writing in literary present tense. So you'll be using present tense verbs. Now, there are times where it is necessary for you to use the past tense, and I've got a couple of examples here and then some information coming up that will further illustrate this. All right, in the first example, we have Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was written over 400 years ago, but it is still touted as the quintessential love story. Today, however, it is really a tragic tale of lust. So in the first part of the sentence, we did use a past tense pronoun. We used was because we're referring to the time in which the story was written, and it was written over 400 years ago. That time is over and done with. It is a specific time in the past, and so we use the past tense verb there. But in the remainder of the sentence, it's important that we use present tense because now we're talking about the story itself. It is still touted as the quintessential love story, but it is really a tragic tale of lust. In the second example, we have John Patrick Shanley's play Doubt takes place during the height of the civil rights movement. Now, even though the civil rights movement happened during the past, we're talking about the story and the setting takes place during that time period. Okay, so we already saw an example of this rule, that when you're describing an author's work, you use the past tense. Here's another example. In 1982, Athol Fugard published Master Harold and the Boys. Again, that is a reference to when a specific work was published. It happened in the past. That time is definitive. It's over and done with, so we go ahead and use the past tense there. And it does matter. And it's not that it matters so much in a rough draft. Again, a rough draft is called a rough draft for a reason, and it's perfectly fine if you make missteps along the way. The reality is, the more you do this, the more practice you get, the more it will become second nature, the more you won't really have to think about it. It's fairly easy to do. Okay, we've already seen some example of this as well. The fact that sometimes a sentence must employ both present and past tense. So in the first example that we have on the left, we have the first part of the poem, which she completed in 1804, describes the effects of isolation from society. So again, in the first part, we have a reference to when the poet finished writing the poem. That was in 1804, so we use past tense there. But when we're talking about the work itself, we're going to use literary present tense, so we need to use the verb describes, which is in present tense. We have a second example from Nadine Gordimer's short story, which addresses the way Black Africans were treated in South Africa during apartheid. So in this example, in the first part of the sentence, we're talking about the short story and what it addresses. So we use the present tense there. But since we're talking about an event that happened in history, in the past, which is the way Black Africans were treated in South Africa during apartheid, then we have to use the past tense there. All right. In the image on the right, we have some examples of just plain literary present tense, and notice how these things apply to other creative works like paintings, as well as, other works that are more text-based in terms of short stories, plays, and novels. In Michelangelo's painting, Christ judges the world. Johnson's characters journey to Cairo. Plato argues without much conviction. And Paul writes about the hardships he has endured. All of those are examples of literary present tense. Okay, there are some things that we need to consider about the introduction. The introduction has some elements that are common to all introductions. There's the hook, the establishment of the issue, the provision of background information if it's necessary, the establishment of the issue, and the thesis. But in addition to that, we need to do a couple of extra things as well. We need to name or identify the author and the work in question, and we need to do this fairly early in the introduction. And the first time we mention the author, we need to use his or her full name, so that would be first name and last name, and then we need to name their work. Things that are short, like short stories or poems, unless they're epic poems, those things are punctuated by enclosing them in quotation marks. If you're talking about things like a play or a novel, things that are long, or even if you're writing an analysis paper over a film, those things are italicized. So do those things early so that you can establish that for your reader. Then you are going to need to provide necessary background, establish aspects of the setting and context if necessary, and provide a brief overview of the story. You can assume that your readers are familiar with the story, but your paper should nonetheless still be clear to someone who has not. And then the last couple of things, just to reiterate, you want to make sure that you've established whatever the issue or the question is in the paper and state a thesis. And if you do the things in this order, that's a pretty effective formula or pattern to follow for the introduction. If you leave the thesis statement for last, it sets up the paper, it sets up the argument for your reader, and it's the last thing that they read before they read your first topic, sentence, and point in support of the thesis. In terms of the body sections, there are many elements that are the same as what you would encounter in a regular paper. You've got to develop and support specific claims in support of the thesis, and you have to use textual evidence. Since the papers that we're talking about in this first unit are based on a primary text, all of your textual evidence will come from, in the first essay, the short story In a Grove, and in the second essay, from the play Doubt. The body sections also shouldn't just lapse into summary, and this is one of the pitfalls that comes with writing about a work of literature, is that sometimes students will present a thesis in the introduction, and then they will simply summarize the story in the body sections, and then in the conclusion they'll just come in and reiterate whatever their thesis is. But you can't do that, and so that's one of the things to kind of look for as you're drafting, and certainly as you're revising and editing. All of the papers that we write in this class, including these first ones, will be arguments, and so every single paragraph needs to present claims and develop those claims and make a case for them. You do have to incorporate textual evidence, and in this case, when we're writing about works of literature, that means the incorporation of quotes or parts of quotes. And by quotes, I don't mean necessarily things that characters say, although that could be the case, but I mean things that you're bringing in word for word from the text and documenting in MLA citation style. So you've got to have those things. You've got to explain, extend, analyze, and connect those things in order to make your argument and to build that. And then, the last thing, which we've already talked about, is that these body sections should use literary present tense when appropriate. For documentation of primary sources, we're allowed to take a few shortcuts since we're just basing it on a single text. A couple of shortcuts we get to take are that we do not have to list the author, the last name of the author in the parenthetical notes along with the page number. We can dispense with that, and we can simply put the page number. We also only have to cite in papers that are based on a single text, as is the case here with the short story and then with the play. We only have to cite the use of direct quotes. And the reason for that is that it's understood that in the analysis of a given short story, play, or novel, it is necessary to summarize or paraphrase aspects of it in order to make a case about it. So if we had to put parenthetical notes for all of those things, the paper would look pretty cluttered with parenthetical notes, so we're kind of given a free pass on that, and we only have to document the use of things that we're directly quoting, directly pulling in word for word from the source that we're analyzing, evaluating, or making an argument about. Just so you know, though, in future classes, if you write a research paper based on a work of literature that you've read, you have to document everything, not only the primary text that you're using, the quotes that you're pulling in, the textual evidence that you're pulling in from there, but all the articles, the journal articles that you're reading, any of the scholarly books that you're reading, those things you have to document, those secondary sources, the articles, anything you paraphrase, anything you summarize. So this means things that you're putting in your own words, even those things have to be documented. And then, of course, the quotes have to be documented as well. Now, that will be true for the papers that we'll write later in the semester, which will be research papers. You have to document anything you summarize, anything you paraphrase, and anything that you quote. In terms of writing the conclusion, there are a few things that you shouldn't do, so we'll take a look at those first before we talk about what you should do. The first thing is it should not begin with the phrase "in conclusion," "in summary," or anything remotely resembling either one of those two things. Not so much because they're wrong, but because they're canned, they're formulaic. And, just because something isn't wrong to do doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most effective thing to do, and that's the case here. We also want to avoid in the conclusion just summarizing what you've already said, and sometimes we do this simply because it's the easy thing to do, but this is not effective. You should give your readers some credit and assume that they have a memory for all of the things that you've said so far, so you shouldn't just summarize, and you shouldn't introduce any new evidence at the end. This is not a body section, so you shouldn't combine a body section with a few concluding lines at the end. A conclusion has a very set list of things it needs to accomplish, so you don't want to waste that space by trying to combine it with a body section. So don't introduce any new evidence. You also shouldn't make any announcements about what you've said already, and you shouldn't use any first-person point of view. This is true of anywhere in the paper. You shouldn't make any announcements at any point in the paper, and you shouldn't use first-person point of view. So I've got an example of that here. So you shouldn't have phrases that say things like, "In this paper, I have argued that," or "I will argue that," if you were in your introduction. And oftentimes students have a tendency to want to do that either in the introduction or the conclusion, but that is not the convention. It's not a good practice to follow. In terms of writing a conclusion, there are some very specific things that you should try to do, and if you follow these things, you'll be well on the pathway to writing a conclusion that does what it needs to do. First and foremost, you should transition naturally and smoothly from the last line of the preceding paragraph. And the easiest way to do that is to go back and reread the last line of the preceding paragraph and look for a word, an image, or an idea that you can tie into or repeat in the first line of your conclusion. Sometimes it can be something as simple as using a pronoun to refer to something that you mentioned in the last line of the previous paragraph. So we want to avoid those formulaic transitions. We want to avoid things that are overly forced. You don't want your reader to even notice that you've transitioned because it's so smooth and everything just reads as a unified whole. Your conclusion should also answer the question, "So what?" for the reader. What is the upshot? What is the big picture? What is the significance of your argument? And by that, I mean, how does your argument and the story it's based on connect to real life? So one of the things you have to do with the conclusion is you have to find a way out of the paper and back into real life. The introduction does just the opposite. It invites the reader into the essay, into the argument, into the story to consider the things that you present, and the conclusion has to ease the reader back out of the paper, back out of the story, and back out into real life, and it has to show the relevance. Why did you want them to read this particular paper? What do you want them to get out of it? What is the connection? What is the value that it could add to their lives? And to do that, you might want to ask yourself, how do you want the readers to feel? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to do? What do you want them to take away with them after having read your paper? And so that's a pretty tall order, and that means that you should agonize over your conclusion kind of the same way that you agonize over the introduction, because this is the last thing that your reader will see, and this is your last opportunity to create a good impression and to seal the deal. This is your last opportunity to convince your reader or to elicit, the desired response. You should also try to tie back into something from the introduction to the paper or to the title if you've already established one at this point. If you haven't, or if it's just kind of a title placeholder and you come up with a really amazing one later, you may wish to come back and revise and edit your conclusion, and maybe you wish to tie into that. But the point is that you should tie back into something from the beginning of your paper, because this is a neat trick to help you bring the paper full closure, to bring it full circle, and to help you bring about a satisfying sense of resolution to the paper. The last element of the conclusion should be an attempt to end the paper with a powerful line that brings that satisfying closure to the essay. We've all probably had that experience where we've gone to a movie that was really good and we enjoyed it. It had a good opening. We were at the edge of our seat. We enjoyed the evolution of the movie. But if the ending is rushed, if the ending is formulaic, if it's canned, if it's dissatisfying in any way, or if it ends rather abruptly, then oftentimes this mars the experience of watching the movie as a whole. Now, maybe it didn't mar the experience up to the ending, but as we leave out of the theater and we reflect back on it, you know, our memories and our minds may be telling us that, oh, that was a terrible movie, or it was a mediocre movie, and we're basing that just on the fact that we were dissatisfied with the ending. So you don't want to drop the ball at the end of the paper. And I know that by the time we get to the end of the paper, generally you're tired, you just want to be over with it, you want to be done with it. And if that's the case, maybe you should walk away from it, come back to it when you're fresh and ready to spend some time on the conclusion, because this really is kind of the last opportunity that you have to create a positive impression, you know, on the reader.